So in this project, we'll analyze the history of the monetary and fiscal policy in Colombia, following the general framework. And I'm going to show what we found in data so far. So what we found, we identified three cycles of government financing. The first cycle, the government finances deficit mainly through foreign debt. In the second cycle, mainly through monetary emission, so seigniorage. And in the last cycle, through domestic debt. And our hypothesis of why this was so was that until 1991, the government was relatively small. So its financing decision depended on the cost. And in the first cycle, borrowing abroad was relatively cheap. In the second cycle, it became more expensive, so it relied on monetary emission. But after 1991, the government became bigger, so the needs to finance became more important, and therefore there was a need to develop the domestic government debt market. So before I go into the data on the fiscal deficit, I just want to point out a couple of issues, well, no issues, a couple of characteristics of Colombian macroeconomy. And mainly, opposite to many countries in Latin America, the macroeconomy in Colombia is not that interesting in the sense that the volatility is much lower. So there have been a couple of works where in particular this about Kodama, he estimates the cost of the fluctuations, and the cost of the fluctuations for Colombia is the lowest in Latin America, and among the lowest in emerging markets. And in particular, there have been very few recessions in Colombia. So there has only been 3 years in the 20th century. There were only 3 years in the 20th century with negative real GDP growth. One was in 1999, and the other two were during the Great Depression. So not even in the early 80s, the GDP actually grew. And the other characteristic about Colombia is that it had for a considerable long time high and persistent inflation, but never in the levels observed in other Latin American countries. So actually, inflation in Colombia barely went over 30%, although for some decades it was between 20 and 30%. And I think this is interesting because it's opposite to many countries, but also I think it's also interesting that there was no periods of higher inflation, given that before 1991, the monetary authority was not independent from the government. So before 1991, the monetary authority was a monetary board whose members were basically members of the government. All but one of the members of the monetary board were ministers of the government. And there is still considerable indexation to inflation. And well, there has been many forms of armed conflicts which have introduced some fluctuations, but that didn't happen in Colombia. I'm saying 1991 because in 1991 there was a big change, a big political and economic change. There was a new constitution, and since 1991 the central bank is by law independent from the government, and there's an explicit objective for the central bank to have low inflation. And it's very difficult for the central government now for the central bank now to lend to a government. Before it wasn't the case. So well, the framework is as before.
So before you go into the framework, can I ask you a general question?
Sure.
The issue of this armed conflict that you mentioned, and also the drug,
related
business.
Yes.
So that doesn't show up in micro statistics in.
Not as. So I would expect ex ante to find much higher volatility, and that isn't the case.
And in demand for cash or these things, or does it?
Not so much. That's surprising actually. So I would want to have a theory about that's the case, given that the incentives were there to have it, but that isn't the case.
But you were saying that the government was smaller before and now it's getting bigger after.
Yes. So that would be one of the reasons. The government was very small, and actually the deficits weren't that big, as I'm going to show in a couple of slides, until 1991. Since 1991, they have become bigger.
But can this be the motive, the activities and the drug problem and stuff? Can that coincide with the 1990 changes?
No, because the main problem of drug dealing began in the 80s. So before before the constitution changed. So we're going to explain the deficit in terms of government debt issued domestically, government debt issued abroad, and monetary emission. And these transfers are going to be the residual of what we cannot account for. So the data I'm going to show is from the national central government. So we don't include local governments, mainly due to data availability. but also because the local governments in Colombia rely, one of their biggest source of revenue is transfers from the national government. The local taxes don't account for much. So with respect to government debt, when I say...
I didn't understand that. So if local governments spend more than their income, so you're saying that they don't collect income, but they have expenditures. So those expenditures are part of national central government.
Yeah, will be accounted. Yeah, they'll be financed through the national central government. They account. They're there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. They're there. Yeah. But from the point of view, so one same deficit is the central government.
Do they show up? Do they show up as a transfer? Or if the central government is sending money to the provinces or whatever, does it show up as a transfer of the central government?
Yes, in the accounting, yes, so like above the line, yes, they show transfers to central government. So what I do is I take the deficit and I explain how they finance the deficit. So in the data I have, so the T there, that would be like net of the transfers that the government sends to a local government, to a local.
But the local governments determine the level of expenditure, or is the central government that determines that?
It's mainly the central government. The local government, so Colombia is a centralized country. Yeah, departments have not much autonomy, fiscally at least.
So they cannot issue that?
Funny, they can, like Bogota, the capital has bonds, but it's tiny. And it's not that liquid either. And they levy taxes, but it's also tiny. Their main source of revenue is transfers. So when I talk about the government debt, when I talk about domestic, it means issued in Colombia. Mostly it is in Colombian pesos. There's some exceptions, but the data availability is not that rich, especially. So until very recently, you can identify the currency, but it's mostly in Colombian pesos. And the same when I say foreign debt, I mean issue abroad, which is mostly in US dollars. Another thing, so there is indexed government debt, but it represents, it's not very big, and it only became, the data for this is only available until very recently. So there were some indexed bonds in the 80s, but that doesn't account for very much, so I include that into the domestic debt. And we also have data for expenditures in interest payments, so that allows us to estimate some implied interest rate. We have data for a couple of years on the marginal rate for foreign debt, but not for the whole sample. So when we refer to monetary emission, so prior to 1991, this includes net credit from the central bank to the government, and it includes something that is called the special exchange accounts, which I'll go in detail in the next slide. And after 1991, it's just profits from the central bank. So regarding these special exchange accounts,
these profits are transferred to the treasury.
Yes. So exactly. So we include that as a way of financing the deficit, but they only appear for some reason in the statistics, this account is zero until like 1995. Then it becomes positive, and then the recent years actually have been losses, but it hasn't been registered as a transfer all the way back. It's just registered as a zero transfer from the central bank to the government, which is some accounting issues. So these special exchange accounts, they were created in 1938. They lasted until 1993, a couple of years after the new constitution. And they're the resources derived from management in the exchange rate. So that's profits or losses from the exchange rate. But they also include taxes on coffee exports and remittances. So these special exchange accounts, they have a monetary component, so like a seigniorage component, but also have an income component for the government. So that's why we start in 1963, in part because we rely on a paper we found that actually is able to identify which part of these special exchange accounts.
So this was it was part of the central bank, or it was a different?
Now it is in the central bank before 1991. So now it is basically is a fund in exchange reserves to account for losses due to exchange rate management. Before it was from the monetary board, which was technically not part of
the... getting the income from these taxes too?
Yes.
Not anymore since 1991?
Since 1991, it doesn't include these taxes. In 1993, these things don't exist.
Okay.
Okay, so with respect to the data sources, so we begin in 1963 instead of 1960 because we rely on this work because these guys are the ones that identify which components of the special exchange accounts correspond to monetary emission basically, and which parts correspond to income of the government due to taxes. And we also rely, recently the Ministry of Finance publishes data from how the government finances its deficit. So for the years in between, we try to be as consistent as possible, rely on some estimates from the central bank for the 90s. And this couple of years, we went into the books to try to be consistent with this data. And the expenditures on interest debt. So we have data on the fiscal deficit to get a measure on the primary deficit. We rely on the work by Junguito and Rincon, who have a series on expenditures on the interest on debt. So this is what the fiscal deficit in Colombia looks since 1963. So the three cycles that we identify are this one, and then this one. So they have become bigger. That also coincides with the government having become bigger. When we estimate, so here what I'm showing is an estimate on the primary deficit, which we get just from getting the series on expenditures on interest on the debt. But until very recently, those expenditures on the interest on debt have been very small. So just until very recently, the primary deficit and the fiscal deficit have been kind of different. Before, primary deficit and fiscal deficit have been very similar.
But the debt was very small, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. I mean, the government, in principle, in essence, the government was very small until here. So the three cycles we identify. So in this, I don't know, this graph is maybe it's too much information there, but it's okay. So the first cycle would be this one. Well, the main source of government was foreign debt. The second cycle would be around this one, where the main source of financing by the government was monetary emission. And the last cycle would be this one, where the main source of financing was domestic debt, or is domestic debt.
So basically, the red one is issuing foreign debt, but
Yes.
that never went beyond 1% of GDP.
Recently, it has been.
Oh, yeah, sorry, in the first
Yes.
cycle. Then the blue one is money emission, and then the black one is
Domestic debt, exactly. And the green one is the remainder.
Ah, the transfer. Okay, these transfers.
Yep.
How come they're exactly zero until 1990?
Well, this is where we rely on the work by these guys, and for some reason they're able to. Since it's the remainder, they're able to perfectly.
They constructed it using it. Okay, I see.
I guess this is actually the remainder from the statistics, and there's a funny thing here. And then if you see this spike, this kind of corresponds exactly to this thing. And throughout these years, when there's a spike in one, there's a spike on the other direction there. We've asked. It seems to be accounting issues. So if for instance this spike, it seems to be a year where due to a deadline in the accounting, there was some resources that were identified as foreign debt, but they were actually resources that were going to be used. So they're in a foreign account basically, and they were identified as foreign debt when they actually wasn't foreign debt. So we've been talking to some people to see how we can account for this better, because it creates some noise.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do now is go through each of the cycles. So the first cycle is the smallest one in the sense that the deficit in this cycle peaked at 1.2% of GDP. Financing was mainly through foreign debt. And the cycle begins with the establishment of the monetary board, and it ends just before a boom in the price of coffee. So the monetary board was the foreign exchange monetary and credit authority for around 30 years, for 28 years exactly. It was established, in theory, it was established because the government was afraid that the private sector had too much influence on the monetary policy. So it decided to change the law, and it made the monetary board, whose members were ministers, the head of the central bank, and two advisors. So many.
Before that?
Before that, before that is kind of fuzzy. So there was the board of, in principle, the board of directors of the central bank. So the central bank was the monetary authority before that, right? But in the board of directors of the central bank, there were also a couple of ministers who had initially they only had opinions, so veto power, but then they also had voting power. So it was kind of fuzzy. It's not.
But what do you mean by the private, the monetary policy? You had like.
They were okay. So the central bank was established in 1923, and in the original board of directors, there were representatives from the main economic sectors.
Okay.
So from banks, from industrial.
Okay.
So they were there. So that began to change a couple. There were like 3 reforms between that. And in 1963, there was, and this scheme lasted until 1991.
Okay.
And but in practice, what this did, what the monetary board was, it turned the central bank into a development bank. So opposite to many Latin American countries, Colombia never had a development bank, but it was basically because it didn't need one. The central bank was the development bank. So inflation during this time was high, and it became socially acceptable. And the reason why it became socially acceptable is because there was a lot of indexation going on. So wages were indexed. Actually, nowadays, there's still a lot of indexation. So nowadays, everybody gets a raise depending on the inflation. And the minimum wage increases by more than the inflation each year. And also during this time, this time, if I have time, I'll go into detail, but there was a new project to make mortgages available to more people, and the rates of these mortgages were decreasing in real terms. So even though inflation it became increasing, it was as if the country became more tolerable to inflation as the years went through. So in the 70s, there actually was in the single digits, and then it began to increase to between 20 and 30%, and it stayed in that level for many years. But interestingly, even though inflation was in a high level, the main source of financing was foreign debt. One of the reasons was because Colombia was not the exception to the Latin American countries. So Colombia, there were foreign resources available. Although it is interesting that most of the loans that Colombia got were from multilateral entities. And this explains why the interest rate was not very high. So there will be this black line, the marginal one. So it was around 6% for some time, then it increased a little bit. But throughout this time, the government was fairly small. So the government was between 5 and 7%. Government expenditures were between 5 and 7% of GDP. So even though tax revenue wasn't very high, that wasn't a big deal. It wasn't such a big deal. With respect to foreign exchange policy, before 1997, there were multiple exchange rates. Then in 1967, there was a new law that changed everything, and the government established a crawling peg and capital controls. And this lasted since 1997 until 1991. So basically, the crawling peg meant that the government, the monetary board controlled the evaluations, daily evaluations. And this is one of the multiple exchange rates that were before. So the idea of the crawling peg was sort of to maintain a real exchange rate fairly constant. Although this was true in this period, in the next one isn't. Let me skip this. If I have time, I'll go back to this. So that will be the first period. So the second period, from 1976 to 1991, in this period, financing was done mainly through monetary emission. And this period begins with a big rise in the price of coffee and ends in 1991 with a new constitution. And as a fact that I find interesting is that opposite to some countries in Latin America, the 80s were not a lost decade in Colombia in the sense that there was average growth that was almost, I think, twice as the average in Latin America. And I remember that as I was growing up, I remember my parents saying explicitly that it was common. My parents used to say that at that time in Colombia, everything was bad except the economy. And that was kind of the feeling of everybody. The economy was the only thing that was working.
Yeah, and in fact, like historically, Colombia has always grown at around the same rate as the U.S. It's like even for the last 150 years. It's remarkable to see how basically nothing happens.
It is. I think they.
It doesn't converge and it doesn't diverge. It's just.
That's true. Well, we were converging slightly recently, but not anymore. But yeah, I think what's interesting about the Colombian economic history is how not interesting it has been. So this is a graph of the price of coffee. So in nominal terms, the price of coffee it increased 7 times in a lapse of 2 years. And this was at a time where more than 50% of exports of Colombia were coffee. Actually, during this peak, it was more than 60% of exports. So in this period, there were a lot of resources coming into the economy, a lot of dollars, and since there was a fixed exchange rate, basically there was real appreciation. And this caused high and persistent inflation. So this is a quote by the president of the time, that he said, the boom is for the coffee growers. So he didn't let the exchange rate to appreciate, he just let it devalue. And then in the 80s, when dollars were not coming into the economy, what happened was that there was a steeper nominal devaluation. So this led to a real depreciation. So this is the nominal exchange rate. This is during the coffee boom, and then the devaluation increased by more. So they used to say that the devaluation was step by step, and then here it changed to like leap by leap. And then real appreciation, and then real depreciation. So during this period, it is as if there was inflation targeting, but the target was around 25%. So inflation never went above 30%, but it never decreased 20%, well, with some exceptions. Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. No, this is just percentage. Sorry. Well, this is just to mention that the crisis of 1982 wasn't such a crisis in Colombia. GDP actually grew in that year. And one of the reasons why Colombia, so Colombia was kind of lucky in the sense that when many Latin American economies were borrowing abroad, Colombia was receiving a lot of resources because of coffee exports. So Colombia only borrowed until the end of the boom, and it didn't borrow that much. And one of the reasons it didn't borrow that much was because the interest rate was much higher than before. So the financing in this period was mainly through monetary emission, and explicitly through two sources: profits from the exchange rate policy, and also the central bank had to rescue a couple of banks. There wasn't an economic crisis, but there was a banking crisis. So some banks actually had to be rescued, and the central bank was in charge of rescuing them. That also explains the monetary emission. So there will be the sources of financing during this period, which was mainly monetary emission.
Sorry, what exactly do you mean with profits from exchange rate policy?
So so basically the central bank had to, especially during the coffee boom, when there were a lot of dollars coming to the economy, the central bank was still maintaining a crawling peg. So it was basically buying cheap dollars every time in order for the crawling peg to be sustained. Then that was just at the beginning. Then it didn't hold that well. And then in the last period, which is from 1991 on, financing has been done mainly through domestic debt. So this period begins with a new constitution, and it includes the economic crisis of 1999, which, in the Colombian economic history, has been kind of the interesting event recently. So important economic aspects from the constitution was before there were big changes to a central bank. So the monetary board ceased to exist, and the decisions made by the monetary board began to be taken by a board of directors of the central bank, which was independent, although the Minister of Finance is part of the board of directors, and it's actually the head of the board of directors. The constitution now, by constitution, it is difficult to lend to a government, so it's not impossible, but the only way that the central bank can lend to a government is if there's an unanimous vote in the board of directors, and that hasn't happened. And it didn't happen in the 90s. I don't think it's more difficult than it will happen right now. And it is prohibited to lend to the private sector, and now the seigniorage is just limited to the profits of the central bank, which is mainly the profits it gets from foreign exchange reserves management. So another big important issue about this constitution was, in Colombia, we refer to as la apertura, so the opening. The economy opened, so they liberalized the capital account. There was a more liberal financial sector. Before this year, foreigners could not own banks. Since this year, they can. Importantly, the government became bigger, and one of the reasons it became bigger was because it had to transfer even more resources to a local government. So since 1991, the local governments are the ones that pay directly for education and health, but that's being done mainly through transfers from the central government. So and actually, as a percentage of GDP, the government has increased, so it has basically doubled. Interestingly, the tax revenue, the government will be the red line, the government expenditures, the black line is tax revenue. So interestingly, tax revenue has also been increasing, but the difference has also increased. So deficit has also increased. So let me explain this through graphs. Another thing that happened, in the early 90s, what happened was, how much time do I have? Sorry. So during the early 90s, as the government was increasing, that also meant that the fiscal deficit was also increasing, but also there was an increasing current account deficit, which was mainly financed through foreign debt. But it was foreign debt, not so much government debt, but mainly private debt. So these macro imbalances added to some financial frictions that didn't allow these resources coming into the economy to go through the most efficient sectors. This led to the crisis of 1999. So in this year, GDP growth was negative. So it was the first year since 1931 that GDP growth had been negative. So it was a big deal in Colombia. But also this meant unemployment doubled. It reached almost 20%. There were some bank runs. There was a mortgage crisis. But importantly, this led to big changes also in the monetary policy and in the foreign exchange policy. So in the early 90s, with the new constitution, the foreign exchange policy went from a crawling peg to a band system. So the exchange rate was allowed to fluctuate, in quotes, around the band. Due to a crisis, the band was eliminated, and then the foreign exchange is allowed to float freely. This is the real exchange rate. So in the 90s, there were a lot of resources coming into the economy, and due to the band, this led to a real exchange appreciation. Then in the late 90s, was a real exchange depreciation, and then it was more closer to the nominal exchange rate. But after 1999, so there was a flip in the exchange rate, and before 1999, due to the fact that the foreign exchange policy meant that the foreign exchange has to be within some bands, that also tied the hands of the monetary policy. So since 1999, there's now inflation targeting. So and the policy instrument is the interest rate. So this graph just shows inflation in the last period. So since 1991, with the constitution, it explicitly said that the central bank had to protect the purchasing power of the Colombian peso. And since 1992, the central bank started establishing objectives, but the objective wasn't met. And it was only met until very recently. And actually now inflation, now the objective of the inflation is what was considered the long term. The target is the red line. The black line is the actual inflation.
That in my culture, that's meeting the target. That's okay.
Well, yes, yeah. Okay. So relatively, here inflation was high, and they wanted to be lower. Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, yes. Here it would be meeting the target. Was big, but now since the targets have been established, actually since in 2003 was the first year where they actually established a range, and since they established the range, I think there have been only like 3 years where the target hasn't been met. Here one above, one below, and then the other one is going to be this year, where it's going to be above.
Target in Colombia.
The three.
Target every year because
yes. But this big drop was due to a crisis, to economic crisis.
No, but you change the target also.
Yeah.
So it's not like in Chile that you say you have a target of 3% minus plus 1%.
That's exactly how it holds. That's exactly what it is with the same numbers. Yes. So in 1992 they began.
Target is not what they consider optimum at the time, but what they consider realistic to achieve next year.
Exactly. What they're going to commit to achieve.
That is this.
Yeah.
So it's not like that's the optimum.
Although here, around after the crisis, they did establish that 3% was going to be the long-term target, and it was reached due to the financial crisis. It was reached earlier than they expected. They expected it to be reached, like 5 years later. Perfect. Okay, so in this period, also financing was done mainly through domestic debt market, and it came hand in hand with the development of a domestic government debt. Sorry, financing was done mainly through domestic debt, and it came hand in hand with the development of a domestic government debt market, which the government bonds are called TES. And that, as a consequence, that also brought a deepening of on the collateralized interbank market, especially since the crisis, since 1999. So there will be the graph of the fiscal deficit, and it has been financed mainly by the domestic debt, which is the black line. And well, that will be it. So we were able to identify 3 cycles of government financing. Our theory was that only since 1991, when the government became big, the government actually actively tried to develop a domestic debt market to be able to finance its deficit. Before, in the previous 2 cycles, it just went with the cheapest option. And one thing that is pending that we want to explore more is the relation between foreign exchange policy and the fiscal and monetary policy. In particularly in the 80s, when the crawling peg steepened, so where the devaluation steepened, and that coincided with some years where the fiscal deficit increased a lot. So there might have been some optimal decision there to make the evaluation steeper.
I mean, this is a paper that it's not that easy to discuss because, first of all, I know nothing about the monetary and fiscal history of Colombia, so I learned a lot by reading it. So hopefully there's at least a little bit that I can add to this. But again, it's not a topic I'm very familiar with. But the paper itself, I found it very, very, very interesting, very informative. So what is it that the authors do in this paper? Well, they analyze how Colombian has chosen or be forced to finance its deficit in the last 40 years or 50 years. Okay? And the 3 sources of financing that they are looking at are well, debt, either foreign or domestic, or what they call monetary emission. And the main results are that in the first part of the sample, the deficit was financed mostly via foreign debt. In the second part of the sample, it was via monetary emission, and in the last part, via domestic debt. Okay? So just to remind you of what the main results are. So this shows the fiscal deficit over the sample. So as has been mentioned before, essentially there are sort of 3 cycles. You can even look at them here. Essentially, in the first part of the sample, there was no deficit to speak of. Then there was this deficit in the 80s, to a large extent resulting from the financial crisis in the early 80s. And there was this other cycle in the 90s and 2000s, mostly the result of essentially spending more than they raised in taxes. Okay? And if the result of the composition is this one, essentially in the first part, the deficit, once again, which was very small, was financed via foreign debts, then monetary financing, and then domestic debt, although foreign debts are also playing a role. Okay? So once again, I find this very informative, but I have a few comments. Now the paper combines a variety of data sources, so I'm sure there is a lot of work involved in digging from all the drawers, all this data. So the data sources are sort of varied. One thing that I think the authors should probably do is try to look at how consistent these data sources are. So for example, I think that some of them, they overlap, so maybe it would be nice if you show some picture in which you have them, well, this is what you get from this source, this is what you get from this other source, and then periods in which they overlap, they actually look the same. That would be comforting for the reader. For example, when you look at some point you mentioned that if you look at interest rates, there has been a change in definition of what interest rates on domestic debt is. At some point before 91, they included loans by the central bank, but not after. So I don't know if there might be other things, but so. In terms of the definition of domestic debt, so the way in which you define domestic debt is essentially by where the debt has been issued, okay? Which it doesn't necessarily align perfectly either with the currency. So you show some counterexamples. So there are some foreign currency debts issued domestically, some domestic currency debts issued abroad, and of course it doesn't necessarily align with the residence of the lenders. So these are all different dimensions that you might want to focus on. I understand that this is the data you have, place of issuance. It's not obvious which one of those is better. Depends on what sort of questions you have in mind. My view is that it probably is more correlated with residency than with currency, but in the latter part of the sample, I have a feeling that that might be less the case. So I'll mention something about that. One question that I had is, why is it that you focus on the primary deficit? If I think of a country needing to find resources to finance its obligations, personally, I think that you should look at the total deficit, at the fiscal deficit, as opposed to the primary deficit. Moreover, the data you have is on the total deficit, but then you construct the primary deficit using some interest rates, which they seem not perfect. So I don't know why is that you don't just focus on the total deficit, and I think it's probably more relevant. Now, this is the dynamic budget constraint you use, which is the same everybody uses, so there is no much need to explain. But personally, I found it somewhat unclear exactly how. So first, these transfers, it's not exactly clear to me what they are. You don't define them. So I don't know what those stand for. Every other term is sort of self-explanatory. So one big question that I have is, and I know this is sort of an ongoing debate even when you look at advanced countries today, is whether you should look at the consolidated government, at the budget constraint of the consolidated government, or the sort of the central government. So you've chosen, I guess, the latter. Okay. But I think this is somewhat problematic. So at the very least, this should be defended to some extent. You choose this one, okay. But so for example, personally, I think the consolidated government would have made more sense. But then if that's the case, then M should have been the money stock, as opposed to the way you define it, which is only loans, direct loans from the central bank to the government, and central bank profits and some other adjustments. And then the debts should not include the debts that are held by the central bank. So instead, essentially M for you is direct financing from the central bank to the government, and B seems to include debts held by the central bank, but it's not 100% clear to me that that's the case. Now I think this is important. So for example, imagine that the central bank, you said that in the 80s, the central bank was in the hands of the government. So at that point, the central bank was essentially financing the government directly, I guess, by giving it loans. But then when the charter of the central bank was fixed or changed in the 91, then that was not allowed. But then I don't know if that's the case, but it could have been that just the central bank now, instead of buying directly the bonds from the government, just buys them indirectly in the secondary market. Now the second one you would call domestic debt financing, and the first one you call money financing, but essentially they are the same thing. So I think that feel that it needs to be clarified a little bit. Now, of course, when people today look at quantitative easing, they think of that as monetary policy and not monetizing the debts or anything like that. So this is an important debate, but I think that I would like to know a bit more about why should look at one and not the other. Other small comments. When you talk about the deficit in the first part of the sample being financed via international loans, essentially, well, there was very little deficit to speak of, and then these international debts essentially were international financial institutions. So you're throwing the same bag, loans from international financial institutions, bank loans, Celeron, and international bonds nowadays. Those objects seem somewhat different. So perhaps that needs to be clarified a bit more. And then again, as I told you, so the way you've defined money financing is such that it does not include open market operations or exchange rate intervention. I wonder whether this might underestimate the importance of the inflationary effects of monetary financing in the middle period. And finally, if I look at the latter part, so these domestic debts, again, these are defined as, which you say that most of the financing now is via domestic debts. This is defined as debts being sold in the domestic market. So I looked online to see if there is any data on who holds those debts, so I didn't find that. But for example, they are listed in the emerging market bond funds of JP Morgan. So these are debts that have been issued domestically, but at least in the 2000s, it seems that they are held to a large extent by foreign holders. So I don't know if I would call them necessarily domestic debts, or at least should be clear that they were issued domestically, but who knows who hold them. So, okay. And that's all I have.